Couple of developments on the 2020 campaign front. We want to talk about those. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, is joining us here, tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Bill, welcome. Thanks for being here this morning.
Good morning.
Joe Walsh has joined the fray, if you will, former congressman. This at a time when President Trump is talking about his approval ratings about 90 to 94%, I think, in one recent poll for Republicans for approval of the president. Does anybody have really a realistic chance of threatening President Trump at this point?
Well, I think President Trump's greatest threat is actually from President Trump, not from other candidates that are going to run against him in the Republican primary. One of the features of Joe Walsh is that he seems to be somewhat of a firebrand and would probably make news and cause attention to be brought to bear on the Republican side of the ticket, but his chances of winning a nomination are very small. Likewise, Governor Weld of Massachusetts, a more mainstream, I would say, sort of Republican candidate, has not caught any fire, even though he's been running for office for a while.
I also note that, and just from a mechanical standpoint, for example, in South Carolina, I believe the administration has made it so that it's almost impossible to even get on the ballot if you want to challenge the president in the primary. The power of incumbency is pretty strong, is it not?
Absolutely. What happens is election laws, depending upon the state and the culture of the state, make it easier or harder to run for political office. We often hear about issues like gerrymandering as being a mode of voter suppression, but at the same time, as you have just noted, sort of filing dates are another one. And that's really designed to keep certain people out of the election, both as candidates but also as voters. People in a society in which probably about 1 out of every 5 people move every year, we find that if you have election laws that make it difficult to be registered in time to be able to vote, you're basically excluding a large percentage of the population. And likewise, for candidates that want to enter the race perhaps later, that proposes very significant barriers to being able to get on the ballot, as well as to develop an organization that can allow you to effectively run.
Bill, let's shift to the Democrats. We did see Seth Moulton has dropped out, although I don't know that a lot of people even knew he was in. John Hickenlooper, former governor of Colorado, has dropped out of the race, as has Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington. Are these withdrawals significant? What does it do, if anything, to the complexity or the complexion, if you will, of the Democratic field right now?
Well, what historically used to happen is that there would be more candidates in the beginning, and then there would be a winning out process. This year, with the Democrats having 26 or 27 candidates, initially we had sort of an uber of candidates, all sort of trying to make their case to be able to challenge for the presidency. Historically, one of the winning out processes in the primary system was when we got to Super Tuesday, which happens a little bit after the initial caucuses and primaries. And when you got to Super Tuesday, it became really evident who had the staff, who had the money, who could really make a significant dent in that challenge to win the nomination. This year, we have so many candidates that are polling less than 1 or 2% that they're in many ways kind of irrelevant, but they do raise questions and they do challenge people. I remember in the debate where Gabbard really came at Harris in terms of some of her campaign positions. Gabbard was a very, very low-rated candidate in terms of her public opinion scores, but she was able to knock Harris back a bit. So we find that some of these candidates that are in the race maybe aren't there to win, maybe are there maybe to make a case. The other thing I would say is that if you go back historically, you have people like Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson that ran for president without necessarily thinking they were going to win, but they wanted certain issues on the table. In this case, in 2020 race, we had people like Jay Inslee, who was making climate change an issue. So while they're not necessarily trying to compete for the nomination, or trying to compete for the stage of what issues are important.
You know, Bill, interesting. You've talked about before how this is really, it's more of a marathon than a sprint anyway, but I'm reminded of 2012 where Tim Pawlenty was the former governor of Minnesota, had been considered one of the front runners, and he kind of ran out of steam money as well. By the time he got to the Iowa caucuses, he was already out of the race. Same thing with Scott Walker, who was considered one of the bright, shining stars of the Republican Party for the 2016 nomination. He, too, outspent, I guess, what his resources were. A big part of this has to do with managing the campaign, and I wonder, are there Democrats who are already faltering on that account?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Tim, because when we look at 2020, while everything you've just said is absolutely true, there's someone who is a little bit underwater in that kind of equation, and that's Pete Buttigieg. He has a very significant pot of money, but really hasn't been able to attract voters. So his resources are outrunning his campaign, and for him that's a real problem. He's been unable to make significant inroads, for example, in the African American community as well as others. So while he is an appealing candidate to many voters, he's still stuck at a relatively low number. If we think about the Big Five, as some people refer to it, he is number 5 out of the 5. He's not in the lowest of the tiers, but he's not really caught fire yet.
And on the Joe Biden, who is still considered the front runner among Democrats, are his gaffes becoming, is it still just Joe Biden being Joe Biden, or is this becoming more problematic for him?
Well, for me, it's a little bit frustrating when I hear this, because Joe Biden is basically leading the polls both nationally and state by state. Virtually every state he is that's being polled, he is ahead. It's almost like a stock that has built into it sort of the negatives. People have made a determination about who Joe Biden is and what his race is all about. In many ways, he occupies a very important lane for the Democrats, that centrist moderate lane, while many of the other top candidates are occupying a more left-leaning lane or no lane at all. So if you go through and you take a look, nationally he's up by about 12.8%, but we don't hold a national primary. We hold a state-by-state primary system, and we also hold an electoral college, which is state-by-state. So you really have to go and look at what's going on in each of these states, and those initial ones, the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary, and South Carolina are very instructive because we may have different winners in some of those. But in many ways, what I don't hear talked about much is that whether or not Joe Biden wins Iowa or New Hampshire, the state of South Carolina is probably a great backstop for him, with a state which has a majority African American population, or a very significant African American population voting in the primaries. He does very strong there. You have to get to Super Tuesday where you see something where someone like Kamala Harris has an opportunity to really shine in California. But that's well into the race of actual votes cast. But at the same time, we have to remember in that this marathon that you mentioned, that goes back to the book by Jules Woodcover in the 1970s, that basically for the Democrats, they're accumulating delegates and they have to get to their magic number. And every state counts. The question is, will some voters become disillusioned because they see their candidate not thriving and then maybe change their vote? We have a situation, for example, with Harris, who seems to be rising a little bit over Bernie Sanders, but she also scores the highest in terms of her supporters being willing to consider other candidates, whereas Joe Biden's supporters are much more loyal and are much more steadfast with him. So while there's enthusiasm, there's also sort of maintaining the pace, and I think we have to take that all into consideration.
And, of course, we have to, as you just said, remember that the first actual test is not until the Iowa caucus is February the 3rd of next year.
Absolutely.
So we'll see what happens. Dr. William Rosenberg. Bill, as always, thank you, sir.
Have a great day. Take care.
Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joining us. Thoughts on the 2020 campaign, tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg, Rosenberg.